I never thought I'd be standing in Marcus Webb's apartment at 2 in the morning, holding a shoebox full of letters that would completely rewrite everything I thought I knew about my brother. But there I was, tears streaming down my face, reading words that Daniel had written but never had the courage to send, understanding for the first time why he'd seemed so distant in those final years, and why Marcus had looked so devastated at the funeral. Let me back up. My brother Daniel died 3 years ago in a car accident. He was 28, I was 23, and we'd grown apart in the years before his death in a way that always haunted me. We used to be inseparable as kids, but sometime around his mid-20s, he became withdrawn, stopped calling as much, seemed uncomfortable during family gatherings. I blamed myself, wondered what I'd done wrong, replayed our last awkward conversations looking for clues. At his funeral, I noticed Marcus immediately. He stood at the back, barely holding it together, and when he approached the casket, he broke down completely. I had no idea who he was. Daniel had never mentioned a Marcus Webb. My parents didn't know him either. He introduced himself as Daniel's friend from work, offered his condolences, and left quickly. Something about the rawness of his grief stuck with me, but I was drowning in my own pain and didn't think much more about it. 3 years passed. I moved to the city where Daniel had lived, partially for a job opportunity, partially because I felt closer to him here somehow. I'd been settling into my new apartment for about a month when I ran into Marcus at a coffee shop. I recognized him immediately, those same sad green eyes, though he looked older now, more tired. He was sitting alone by the window, staring at his laptop without really seeing it. I don't know what possessed me to approach him. Maybe it was the loneliness of being in a new city. Maybe it was the unresolved grief that still sat heavy in my chest. Or maybe it was just that he was a connection to Daniel, and I was desperate for any piece of my brother I could find. I walked over and said his name. He looked up, confused at first, then recognition flooded his face along with something that looked like panic. We talked for 2 hours that first day. Well, I talked mostly. I told him about moving to the city, about how I was still trying to understand why Daniel and I had drifted apart, about the guilt that kept me up at night. Marcus listened with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable, like every word I said physically hurt him. When I asked him how he knew Daniel, he said they'd worked together for 5 years, had been close friends. The way he said close friends felt weighted somehow, but I didn't push. We started meeting regularly after that. Coffee once a week turned into twice a week, then dinners, then just hanging out at his place watching movies. Marcus was easy to be around once he relaxed. He was funny in a dry, unexpected way, incredibly thoughtful, and we had this natural chemistry that I couldn't quite name. He'd catch me staring sometimes and look away quickly, a blush creeping up his neck. I found myself thinking about him between our meetings, looking forward to seeing him with an eagerness that felt like more than friendship. Around month 3 of knowing Marcus, things started shifting between us. The tension became palpable. Our knees would touch on his couch and neither of us would move away. His hand would brush mine, reaching for popcorn, and we'd both freeze. I'd catch him looking at me with such longing it made my chest ache. But then he'd shut down, make an excuse, create distance. It was confusing and frustrating because I was starting to realize that what I felt for Marcus went way beyond friendship, and I was pretty sure he felt the same way. One night, after several beers in a particularly charged moment where we'd ended up sitting so close I could feel his breath on my face, I kissed him. For about 3 perfect seconds, he kissed me back with such desperate intensity that I saw stars. Then, he pulled away like I'd burned him, stood up abruptly, and asked me to leave. I was devastated, confused, convinced I'd misread everything. I texted him the next day apologizing, saying I'd misunderstood, that we could just be friends. He didn't respond for 3 days. When he finally called, his voice was rough, like he'd been crying. He asked if I could come over, said we needed to talk. I showed up at his apartment that evening, terrified he was going to tell me he never wanted to see me again. Instead, he opened the door looking absolutely wrecked, eyes red and swollen, and said, "There's something I need to show you about Daniel, something I should have told you months ago." He led me to his bedroom, which I'd never been in before, and pulled a shoebox from the top shelf of his closet. His hands were shaking as he handed it to me. Inside were dozens of letters, all in Daniel's handwriting, all addressed to Marcus. Some were dated going back 7 years, others were more recent. The last one dated just 2 days before Daniel died. Marcus sat on the edge of his bed, head in his hands, and said, "Read them. Then you'll understand everything." I sat down next to him and opened the first letter. It was dated 7 years ago, shortly after Daniel had moved to this city. "Marcus," it began, "I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to give you this, but I need to write it down. I need to admit, at least to this piece of paper, that I'm in love with you. I have been since the day you started working here, since you made that stupid joke about the printer and smiled at me like I was the only person in the room." My hands started shaking. I looked at Marcus, who was crying silently, then back at the letter. I read through them one by one, watching my brother's love story unfold in words he'd been too afraid to speak. The early letters were full of longing and fear, Daniel wrestling with his sexuality, terrified of how our conservative parents would react, scared of losing the family he loved. Then the tone shifted as Daniel and Marcus apparently grew closer, as their friendship deepened into something more. Around year 3, the letters became different. They referenced conversations they'd had, moments they'd shared. One letter described their first kiss in vivid, beautiful detail. Another talked about a weekend trip they'd taken, how Daniel had never felt so free, so completely himself. They'd been together, secretly, for 4 years. 4 years of my brother having this entire life I knew nothing about, this love he couldn't share with his family because he was terrified of rejection. The later letters broke my heart. Daniel wrote about wanting to come out to us, about planning to bring Marcus to family Christmas, about imagining a future where he didn't have to hide. But he also wrote about his fear, about overhearing our father make homophobic comments, about our mother's reaction when a cousin came out. He wrote about the pain of keeping Marcus separate from his family, how it was tearing him apart, how Marcus deserved better than being someone's secret. The last letter, written 2 days before he died, was the hardest to read. Daniel had decided he was going to come out to us the following week. He was terrified, but determined. He wrote about how much he loved Marcus, how he couldn't keep living a divided life, how he hoped our family would choose love over prejudice. He never got the chance to send it. He never got the chance to tell us. I was sobbing by the time I finished reading, my vision blurred with tears. Marcus hadn't moved, hadn't said a word, just let me process. Finally, I managed to ask, "Why didn't you tell me? At the funeral, or when we first met again, why didn't you say anything?" His voice was barely a whisper when he answered. "Because I was angry at first, angry that Daniel's family didn't know him, didn't really see him. But then I got to know you, and I realized you were just as much a victim of his fear as I was. You lost your brother without ever really knowing him, and that's its own kind of tragedy." He took a shaky breath and continued. "And then I started falling for you. God, I tried not to. I felt so guilty, like I was betraying Daniel's memory. But you're so much like him in some ways, the good ways, the ways I fell in love with. And you're also completely yourself, and I was drawn to that. When you kissed me, I panicked because I wanted it so badly, but I felt like I didn't deserve it, like I didn't deserve to be happy with Daniel's brother when Daniel never got his chance at happiness. I set the letters down carefully and turned to face Marcus fully. My mind was reeling with revelations, grief, and something else, something that felt like understanding finally clicking into place. "Marcus," I said, taking his hand, "Daniel wrote in that last letter that you deserved better than being someone's secret. He was planning to come out because he loved you that much. Don't you think he'd want you to be happy? Don't you think he'd want both of us to be happy?" Marcus looked at me with such vulnerability it made my chest tight. "I've been in love with you for months," he admitted, "but every time I thought about acting on it, I felt like I was disrespecting what Daniel and I had, like I was trying to replace him with you." I squeezed his hand. "You're not replacing him, and I'm not trying to replace him either. I'm falling for you, Marcus, for who you are, not because you knew my brother, though knowing that he loved you, that you made him happy even in secret, that makes me love you more." We sat there in his bedroom, surrounded by my brother's letters, crying and talking until the sun came up. Marcus told me stories about Daniel I'd never heard, showed me photos from trips they'd taken, shared memories that painted a picture of my brother as fully realized and happy in ways I'd never seen. I told Marcus about the Daniel I remembered from childhood, the brother who'd protected me from bullies and taught me to ride a bike, the person I'd lost long before his death. As dawn light filtered through the windows, Marcus asked, "What do we do now?" I thought about Daniel's letters, about his courage in deciding to live authentically even though he was terrified. I thought about how short life is, how my brother never got his chance to be open about his love. I looked at Marcus, this incredible man who'd loved my brother and who I was falling for despite everything, and I knew what Daniel would want. "We choose honesty," I said. "We choose love. We don't hide like Daniel felt he had to. We honor his memory by living the life he wanted but never got." I leaned in slowly, giving Marcus time to pull away if he needed to. He didn't. He met me halfway. And this time when we kissed, there was no panic, no pulling away. Just the two of us, choosing each other, choosing courage, choosing the kind of love Daniel had dreamed of but feared to claim. We took things slowly after that night. We talked to a therapist, both individually and together, working through the complicated grief and guilt and love all tangled together. I came out to my parents, told them about Marcus, about Daniel. It was hard. My father struggled with it, said things that hurt. My mother cried, mourning the son she realized she'd never fully known. But slowly, painfully, we're working toward understanding. Marcus and I have been together for 8 months now. Some people don't understand it, think it's weird that I'm with my late brother's boyfriend. But we know the truth. We know that love doesn't follow neat, predictable paths. We know that Daniel would be happy we found each other, that something beautiful grew from the tragedy of losing him. On hard days, we read his letters together, remembering the man who brought us both so much love, who taught us both about courage even in his absence. I keep the last letter Daniel wrote on my nightstand. Sometimes I read it before bed, imagining the conversation we never got to have, telling him that I see him now, really see him, and that I love him exactly as he was. I tell him that Marcus makes me happy, that we're living openly and honestly in a way he dreamed of, and that every day we choose courage over fear is a tribute to his memory. I like to think somehow he knows. I like to think he's at peace, knowing that his love story didn't end with him, that it transformed into something new, something that honors everything he was and everything he wanted to be. Total char count, 12,184.